Our public lectures are often based upon many hours of research that is done right here in the reading room, and tonight's lecture is no exception. Our speaker this evening, Christine DeLucia, first came to AAS as a short-term Kate and Hall Peterson Fellow back in 2011 and 12 when she was a Ph.D. candidate at Yale. She returned in 2015-2016 when, as assistant professor at Mount Holyoke College, she was awarded a long-term National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Christine is now associate professor of history at Mount Holyoke College. She received her Ph.D. in American Studies from Yale and is author of Memory Lands, King Philip's War, and the Place of Violence in the Northeast. It was published by Yale in 2018 and is in the Henry Roe Cloud Series on American Indians and Modernity. Her talk tonight is based on this work, and copies will be available for sale afterwards, and Christine will be on hand to sign copies. Christine's writing has appeared in the William and Mary Quarterly, the Journal of American History, Early American Studies, Environmental History, Commonplace, and other publications. She is currently a research fellow at the Newberry Library in Chicago for the 2018-2019 academic year, and she will be joining the history faculty at Williams College in the fall of 2019. Christine was recently elected to membership in the American Antiquarian Society, and we are delighted to have her as part of our family of members here. Her talk this evening is titled Landscapes of Resistance and Resilience After King Philip's War. Please join me in welcoming back to AAS, Christine DeLucia.
Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I am so happy to be back in Worcester. I am living in Chicago this year, and let me say, I really miss Worcester, and I mean that. I first came here to do research in January when I was a graduate student, and I bought the thickest sweater I've ever owned in my life because it snowed for a month. My thanks to American Antiquarian Society for being such a supportive and collegial place for asking questions about history. My thanks to all of you for coming out on this evening to hear about history and memory. My thanks to Nan, Kim, Jim, and so many others who have helped me think in different ways about these topics. And perhaps most of all, my thanks and my acknowledgement to the Nipmuc people and community and nation whose traditional lands we are on. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are in the middle of Native American space here, and that much of what I have to say tonight is about the fact that this is still Native space. It has been for thousands of years, and it continues to be in ways that are important yet not always recognized as they ought to be. I am also very grateful to Cheryl, Tony, Holly, Ray Gould, and other members of the Nipmuc communities whose own historical work has so deeply shaped my thinking, and I want to say that right up front. To get right into this, the topic of memory lands, a title that I struggled with a lot as I began thinking about place, about history, about what it is from the past that carries through today into our lives, into what we understand about ourselves or think we understand about ourselves. To give you a sense of the big questions for this and the where I'm hoping to take you this evening, this project began with my questioning who makes history. Who is an actor who matters? Who shapes what happens? Whose voices are heard? Who inflects in various ways the landscape around us? And who is maybe not recognized in the standard stories that we may have grown up with in school or seen on roadsides or seen on television? More particularly, as I got into this work, I began to ask pointed questions about how conflict has shaped this place that many of us might call New England, but that is also known by other names by the area's indigenous communities. How has conflict, violence, often utter trauma, and genocide, if I may use that word, shaped this region and, by extension, America more generally? What is at stake in revisiting histories that many think they know, but in fact are quite different? And most particularly, how have truly diverse communities remembered the past, this past of incredible violence, but also survival? How have they remembered it in themselves, in their families, in their extended networks, in the public monuments and signs that they make? And what does it mean for us in the 21st century to look back on the 17th and much earlier? So with those as some of the big questions, this book took shape over 12 years. It actually began as a college thesis project, and let me tell you, it has been a long 12 years, in part because I understood quite early that there are so many people in the Northeast who have been engaged in remembering, in telling, in retelling the nature of this time and place, sometimes known as King Philip's War. And I will tell you about that period in just a little bit. I wanted to start us here, though, and really just throw us into the water, if you will, to give you a sense of how I approach history and memory. And I wanted to begin with this photo because it was one of the most striking experiences for me as a young scholar beginning to rethink New England. The photo is being taken from a canoe on the Charles River in Boston, and what you're seeing are three Native community members from Wampanoag and related communities paddling their way towards the downtown in Boston. If I can ask, how many of you have viewed the Charles River in Boston from a canoe? Right? It's a little, okay, one. It's a little bit of a different vantage. And for me, this was such a striking reopening of what this space means. The folks were participating in a memorial, a commemoration of deeply traumatic events from the late 17th century when many Native people were rounded up at the place known as Natick, put onto boats by the English, and transported down this river out into Boston Harbor to be incarcerated or interned on an island in the harbor. And that is where my book begins, with this island. So if I may ask a follow-up question, how many of you have ever had the good fortune to fly into Logan Airport? So I'm glad to be back in Massachusetts. If you have flown into Logan Airport, you have seen Deer Island, and yet you may not know many of these histories. And this is where I want to start us with a provocation here. Deer Island today most visibly has as its built environment a sewage treatment plant. This is what you see if you fly into Logan Airport, right? You see these digester eggs in the background in the top photo. This plant was built in the late 90s into 2000s in spite of immense protest from area tribal communities who pushed back against the idea that a sewage plant would be installed on top of some of the most sensitive grounds in New England. This is the place, remember, where their ancestors were incarcerated and hundreds died over the winter of 1675 to 76 in the middle of King Philip's War. How could a sewage plant wind up on top of this? It did. And that itself tells you a lot about the histories and the values that have shaped New England, the colonial New England. But this is not the only story that is important to tell. And I really want to recognize at least one participant in the audience who is, I believe, featured in this photo at the bottom or near to it. What I wanted to stress in this book was the fact that Native communities have been remembering very different histories for generations, and that for them this is not a forgotten story. This is not a story about Boston as a liberatory site of the Freedom Trail or whatever other popular narrative you may be most familiar with. This is a very violent landscape. It is one imbued with trauma. It is one that is painful and emotional to engage with. And what you see in the bottom photo is part of this ceremony, this memorial to commemorate ancestors that were lost, and to bear witness to this, despite the fact that there is no monument currently on this island or anything to visibly signify what has happened there. So this as a provocation to start with. How can these stories that are seemingly so different coexist alongside each other, whose voices are often not heard, and what does it take to retrieve them or bring them forward and to recognize that communities themselves have long maintained these other places? Memory is dynamic. If I give you nothing else to go home with today, it is the fact that history and memory continue to be remade over extremely long spans of time right here in the Northeast. So to step back just a little bit before then delving into a couple more places that to me are so indicative of these contestations over memory and history and belonging, much of what this is doing is reconceptualizing the native Northeast. And you notice that I don't use the word New England here deliberately in order to get us thinking in different ways about what this space is. This map from my good friend and colleague Lisa Brooks, her own work on the native Northeast, has taken away, right, many of the state or county or town lines that you may be most familiar with. The Mass Pike does not appear on here, right? Instead, we have river highways. We have valleys and mountains and planting areas. And this is much of the space that I and Native scholars who I am deeply indebted to have been working to reorient us to. What happens when this is the space in which we understand ourselves to be grounded? For me, this has also been a process as a non-Native scholar, a non-Native historian, of recognizing and acknowledging in a very deep way Native communities' own ways of understanding history. And I wanted to share with you here some words from Ramona Peters from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe that have sat with me as I think about why we do history and why it's important to reapproach these stories. Ramona Peters writes, "The past has everything to do with who we are in this present moment, both individually and collectively. Personal and collective histories shape our dominant thought patterns, what we miss, what we value, what we desire, and what we miss." As she is so powerfully saying here, history is not optional for the Native nations of the Northeast. It is something that is lived on a daily basis in obvious and more subtle ways, and it is not something that can be turned off. It's not something that lives in a textbook. It's not something that lives in a schoolroom. It's something that is present on a daily basis. And I think many of us may have some aspect of that in our own lives, but there are particular ways that this is important in Native contexts. Much of the work that Native community members like Ramona Peters have been engaged in doing is pushing back against some of the dominant mythologies or sort of popular narratives that have been so influential in New England. And to just give you a little sense of this, we are just a few days past the annual National Day of Mourning that has taken place in Patuxent, you might also know as Plymouth, right over in eastern Massachusetts. And what I'm showing is the 2014 National Day of Mourning, at which many Native people and allies gather at the top of Coles Hill, right? Plymouth Rock is down by the water, which tells one history of New England about pilgrim beginnings. But what happens at the top of the hill recalls the consequences of that pilgrim arrival and the ways that Native people have resisted their own erasure from this place in the face of colonization. This is an ongoing tension, right? Is the Plymouth Rock story about triumphant American beginnings the story that we hold most closely to, or is it a very, very different story that is at stake? To bring this up to an urban context and give you another example of what is at stake, this is a protest that took place only a few years ago in downtown Providence, Rhode Island, where Native community members and supporters gathered to protest a board game that was being produced on the theme of King Philip's War. And as the signs read, I'll read them in case you're in the back, stop playing the genocide game. Genocide is not a game, right? Pushing back against the notion that one of the most traumatic stretches of time in the 17th century Northeast should be the subject of a board game, in which players can literally choose to burn down Native wigwams as part of the action in the game. This gives you a sense of how contested these histories are today and the work that tribal community members continue to do to tell other realities, right? And maybe one final example. I often joke to my friends and family that I can spot these road signs a mile off, the things that signify supposedly about Indian history. but in fact usually have very little to do with the real history. Signs, in this case, particularly related to the figure of King Phillip, the topic of this lecture in my book, and his legacies. King Phillip, a Wampanoag leader in the 17th century who did tremendous work to protect his people and preserve their homelands in the face of colonial onslaught, has been turned into King Phillip Motors, Metacom, his other name, auto sales, and so on. This is a deeply commodified landscape. It is a trivialized landscape. It is one that has almost nothing to do with the actual histories. It has become an empty kind of signifier. And I would invite those of you who are from this area to think about the cases when you may have seen an indigenous name, an individual's name or a place name on a road sign, and what other histories may lie beneath that, right? And finally, I want to give a little bit of sense of what is at stake for the scholarship, and I feel that this is a very timely moment. Has anyone happened to see Jill Lepore's work written up recently? Perhaps if you read book reviews. She has a brand new doorstopper of a book out called These Truths. It's a history of America, the whole thing, and I urge you to read it and think carefully about it. In a strong sense, my own work is responding to Jill Lepore's first book, called The Name of War, King Philip's War and the Origins of American Identity, in which he makes a strong argument that this watershed in the 17th century crystallized Indian identities on one hand and English identities on the other. I read this as an undergraduate and disagreed with much of it and found much of it very exciting. The place where I want to focus tonight is on a question that she posed and ways that we might think differently about answering this in relation to Native communities' own forms of knowledge. She asked in this book she stated how those Algonquians, Native people who survived King Philip's War, commemorated and remembered the war is, sadly, mere speculation. I remember reading this as a student and thinking that seems strange, that there would just be a silence or an absence around how the Native people who went through this tumult in the 17th century understood it. How did their descendants make sense of this? If we take Lepore's point at its face value here, there's seemingly very little way to account for that. And I thought that cannot possibly be true. And much of what I hope to convey tonight are alternative ways that we might think through this seeming silence, which is not in fact a silence. It is a silence created by a limited notion of what a source is, or where information and memory lie. And you may disagree with me on this, but I think that this is a really vital point that early American history is at right now. In choosing to listen to written archives only, or in choosing to open up the ways that we hear stories about the past, talking to people, working with physical objects, walking the land itself. I think there's a lot at stake in the latter approach here. So to move a little quickly through some groundwork here, I was debating where to begin tonight in terms of how memory and commemoration start in the Northeast. And I knew that it cannot begin in the 17th century with King Philip's War. It instead begins at the beginning. And it's really important for me to share this here for all of us to give a sense of why the Northeast itself as a landscape, as a homeland, has been a deeply storied repository of history and memory for Native people for thousands of years. And I'll read this to you. It is an English translation of a story from Wabanaki country, northeast of us here, the main area, but the Wabanaki homelands, as told by Carol Dana, who's a present-day Penobscot language speaker. And this is the English translation. It is telling how Wabanaki places came into being. So as I read this, think about the connections between place and memory and identity. Then said Gluskabe to his grandmother. Gluskabe is a very large giant who shapes the world into its current form. He says, "Now, grandmother, I am going to travel to search for and transform things so that our descendants may not have such hard times to exist in the future. Now I am leaving and shall inspect the rivers and lakes. I shall be gone long, but do not worry. Then he started off paddling and entered all the rivers emptying into the ocean. He inspected them. Wherever there were bad falls, he lessened them so that they would not be too dangerous for his descendants. He cleared the carrying places. Then he left his canoe upside down, where it turned into stone and may be seen there yet. This is a landscape today that Wabanaki people still are engaged with, still tell these stories at these places. I think that it's so important to begin here because this notion of where the world came from, how the land was created for Native people, is profoundly at odds with English colonizers who come from England in the 17th century and understand this place. They often use words, colonizers, like the howling wilderness, the void, the vacuum, the empty space. Whereas for Wabanaki people and for their Native relations, this is a deeply memorial place where their ancestors have been situated and given responsibility for caretaking for over extremely long spans of time. So there's so much more we could unpack about this, but it's important to recognize this sense of identity grounded in the land. And as you'll see, what happens when Native communities in the 17th century and afterwards begin to be forced away from these valued places and struggle to maintain their footholds in them. I was also thinking about what the deep history of monuments is. We've all seen monuments around us. And it's important to note that Native people have been creating structures on the land, again, for time out of mind. This one example from the 18th century, a heap of stones where Native people would have placed a stone at a significant location and told the story of it, right? This is oral tradition connected to place as a kind of archive on the land that doesn't involve written texts. And yet it's so important. What happens if these are not legible to outsiders? Then there's a sense that the history is not there either. And yet for Native communities, the history is very much there. So with that as a little bit of prelude, I wanted to give just the briefest overview of what are some of the factors in the 17th century that lead to this conflict, often known as King Philip's War. And this itself could be a whole discussion, but among the ones that come to mind, there is almost immediately, after English colonization starts in New England, violence. And one of the most horrific examples of this is the attack that happens on the Pequot village at Mystic down in Connecticut. Visualized here in this extremely disturbing woodcut, you're seeing Native homes surrounded by a protective palisade being infiltrated and attacked by English colonists and some of their Native allies. This is so important to reckon with in the 1630s because it primes Native communities to realize that some of their English neighbors are willing to go to lengths of extraordinary violence, even genocide against them. And this shapes the kind of diplomacy and interactions that take place between the 1630s and the 1670s. There is, over the course of the 17th century, increasingly close interaction between Native people and their English neighbors, including at places such as the Harvard Indian College. You can see a plaque to this important site today. It's in Harvard Yard, and a kind of speculative drawing of it here, a place where primarily Wampanoag families sent a number of their young people to study English, to study Hebrew, to study the Christian Bible, partly as a way of training these promising young Native men to then come back to their home communities with skills in English literacy to help defend their own lands and interests and sovereignties. So there is this increasing proximity and familiarity, but it doesn't mean that it's a sort of happy coexistence. Among the other factors that are increasingly causing stress for Native people and nations in the 17th century are loss of land. And we could be here all week looking at a series of land deeds that supposedly sold Native land to English colonizers, but in fact are almost across the board documents attesting to sharing space or to giving certain rights but not actually ceding the land. And this becomes a source of great tension. And this area that we're in right here, Quinsigamon or Worcester, right, is deeply enmeshed in those histories. And there is also the history of missionaries, Puritan Christian missionaries going out into Native communities and pressuring, persuading, asking them to convert to not only Christianity but also English ways. This exercises great pressures on Native peoples. And finally, disease. I think that's often a factor that is mentioned only in passing, but the effect of foreign epidemics on Native communities is devastating. It is uneven in the region, but for some it is something like a 90% population loss in the 17th century. So envision the effect on a community that has lost so many people and is working to rebuild and regroup. This is a moment of rethinking alliances and of strategizing about what the future will look like. And I think of that as one way of conceptualizing King Philip's War. When violence does break out in the summer of 1675, it is not because Native leaders are eager to go to war. They are at their rope's end in terms of attempting to make peace and rebalance relations in the region, but they have reached a point where envisioning a future with the status quo is becoming increasingly not possible. And the recourse to conflict is one attempt to try to change the course of affairs. This is a massive conflict, and in order to make this a little bit more manageable, I wanted to bring to our attention two particular places that have been extremely important, not only in the waging of this and understanding in a different way the nature of this conflict, but also in the remembrance of it and how communities have made sense of this over the years. The first of these is Great Swamp in Narragansett Homelands, just west of Narragansett Bay, claimed by southern Rhode Island. And it was here at Great Swamp in late December of 1675 that Narragansett people and Wampanoags had taken shelter. They had gone into the swamp because wetlands were understood to be very protective places. They were places that the English had very little access to, and they were places that were extremely abundant with resources. I think this is something that English notions of swamps really don't do justice to. These are actually very, very fertile places, right? Known, fertile landscapes. And so Narragansetts and Wampanoags, as this conflict is escalating, seek refuge inside that big green section down there, Great Swamp. It really is an enormous wetlands. I'm sharing this map here to give you a sense of just how much of Narragansett homelands are wetlands, are these protected areas. And Great Swamp is not the only place through which Native leaders were moving their people for protection, but it is a major one. And it is really, it is a coincidental thing, an environmental coincidence, you might say, that in the winter of 1675, it was especially cold out. And this swamp normally would not freeze through in this time of year, meaning that there would be a protective moat around the place where the Native people had been seeking shelter. But this year it froze, and it meant that English militia were able to get there with their horses and with their weapons to attack at Great Swamp. And they inflicted enormous damage there, casualties in the hundreds, if not above, and prisoners taken. I struggle with even how to tell these stories, right? This is such tremendous violence, and I think there's a way that American historians sometimes dwell on the graphic details of what happened. And for me, this project has been a process of recognizing when to be silent and when to be respectful and not actually re-narrate that violence, because itself is a trauma. But this violence is so important. The other thing that I would stress about it is that there are survivors. There are many survivors of this massacre at Great Swamp, and they move out into the other wetlands, and they move into western Massachusetts, and they move north, and they move east to seek refuge with their relations. So this is not the end of the story for the Narragansetts, but as you'll see in a moment, that is the colonial story that becomes frequently told. The other place that I want to share here is sometimes known as Peskeomscot. It is along the middle stretches of the Connecticut or Connecticut River in western Massachusetts, and it had been used for thousands of years, long before colonization, thousands of years, as an ancient fishing and gathering place where people from multiple tribal communities would come together, particularly for the spring fish runs, when they knew that there would be alewife and shad coming up here to replenish them. They would be gathered here at certain times of year. And this is another kind of environmental factor here, that the English in this area have almost no clue about native geographies in this section of western Massachusetts. But they gain intelligence that the native people are at the fishing place in the spring of 1676. And because of that, they are able to surprise in the most violent way the peaceful native encampment that is there. They attack at dawn at Peskeomskid. The English, under Captain William Turner, use their firearms and their swords to drive native people over the waterfalls and to assault others. And this becomes, in a truly horrifying way, a manner for the English of tactically turning an environment that had been one of sustenance and replenishment into a weapon against native people. The land itself, the water themselves are weaponized. Again, there are survivors. And this is so important to stress to make sense of what comes after. There are people who make it out of Peskeomskid and who continue waging this resistance movement for a number of months and arguably years to come. On the topic of memory, I think that this is an especially illustrative map because it does a remarkably good job of visualizing for English readers and leaders right at the end of this war of what the English losses had been. And it does a remarkably bad job of showing what native experiences had been, and this is deliberate. This map, which, so Cape Cod is down there, it's kind of flipped on its side from how people might expect, north is that way, was produced and appended to, right at the end of the war, a narrative by a colonist about what had happened. So this is very much a map from an English perspective. And you can see that there are different towns that are labeled and also numbered here. They equate with a key that describes the native attacks on these English homes and communities. But there is almost nothing to speak to the opposite of this, which is the traumas that the native people across this region had experienced. Peskeomskid is really not on this map. The Great Swamp is also in large part sort of empty wilderness area down there. It's sort of added on later by some people who pencil it into the map. Lake Winnipesaukee is the giant inland ocean of New England here, which gives you a sense of how little the English know about the interior. And I think that this is all important to recognize in terms of how the English, at the very end of this war, are already trying to shape the meanings of it. They are trying to portray this through a very religious lens, but also a more secularized one, as English victims of native hostility and the deep trauma that the English had suffered. And this is something that they deeply felt. But it also becomes a way of erasing indigenous experiences and of not making visible that other part of the story. So I would invite you to think further when you see maps of the Northeast about what is not on the map and what is at stake in erasing certain things or manipulating maps to show some but not other aspects of these places and by extension their histories. This also is produced right in the aftermath of the war, and what I'm doing here is telling you a little bit about the sources that we use as historians and the opportunities but also challenges that they create. And this, for me, is one of the most potent examples of why there is native memory that is accessible through texts at the end of the war, despite what some scholars have claimed. This is a record of a court-martial that is held at Newport, Rhode Island in August of 1676. And why it is so valuable for helping retrieve indigenous experiences of this war and actions in it is that it is filled with statements from individual named Native leaders and participants about how they understood and experienced this conflict. And some of their names and relationships are over on the right. This is a really challenging document to work with. And you can go access it online, I think, from your own computer. Because they are bearing witness, they are giving these testimonies in a very coercive situation, meaning that it's a military punitive tribunal where they are being tried for murder and other outrages against the English. And think about how that might shape the statement someone would make if they know that they are on the stand for those purposes. And indeed, many of these Native witnesses were executed in the close aftermath of this. And so when I read this, I think about the ways that they might have strategically told or shaped their stories so as to protect their loved ones who are still in safety, away from Newport. How might that have affected the type of stories that they told? What is straightforward about this, and what may be a more complex story to tease out? One of my favorite, in a strange way, documents, because it opens up these other vantages on what happens in the immediate post-war period, is this document. And I share this in part to emphasize, for me, the importance of using local archives, local libraries, local historical societies, for getting out of Boston, if I might put it really frankly, which is how many historians of early America concentrate their work. It turns out that there are records about this time and place all over this region, and yet people often don't bother to go read them. So this one is from the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association and Historic Deerfield in western Massachusetts. What it is a land deed granting land to an English individual as recompense, as payment for the fact that he served in King Philip's War in the military and was a participant in what is very euphemistically being called here the Falls Fight. This is the massacre at Peskeomskid at that waterfall. He's being given land many years after the fact for his service. This is one of the ways that the colonies are repaying their veterans. They see this as honorable service, and land is one of the ways that they are deciding to pay. Almost no one has followed these stories out, though, and I became really interested in the townships that were created by giving land to these colonial veterans of the Falls Fight and also of the Narragansett Massacre down at Great Swamp. And I'm mapping here the so-called Narragansett townships, numbers 1 through 7, which were given to veterans or their descendants for participating in the massacre down at Great Swamp. This doesn't happen until the 1730s. And one of the most striking things that you should notice about this map is that the land that's being allotted is not at all near Narragansett country. It's in north-central Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. So think of the ways that this war sets off this chain reaction of colonial expansion in places really far from where the original conflict had actually taken place. And I can attest to you that most of these towns today don't have much sense of where the land originally was coming from here, and that it comes out of this history of contestations. Some other ways in which memory begins to be reshaped after the war. For me, working with objects and thinking about the stories that objects tell is a potent lens into other understandings. And I think this is a case in point from how in the late 18th into 19th century, New Englanders, white New Englanders, are interpreting this moment. They themselves may not have participated in this war, but they are actively thinking about it in all kinds of ways. What I'm showing you here is a really beautiful object. It is a burl bowl, most likely created by a native person, particularly a Wampanoag person, although there's some uncertainty about it. It is acquired by the Massachusetts Historical Society in the late 18th or early 19th century, and the antiquarians there inscribe it with gold lettering, gilded lettering. You can't see it from this photo, but on the inside surface of it here, with a message that tells you how they were thinking about this war. They say, a trophy taken from the wigwam of King Phillip when he was slain in 1676. They're attempting to make a very beautiful piece of native material used for sustenance, for corn, for supporting families and communities, for feasting, into a trophy of conquest. And to use this bowl to give a tangible sense that native history is over. King Philip is dead. There's no sense that he has survivors here, right? This is a conquest trophy, and it's an incredibly powerful one. And yet, the story goes on in ways that this bowl does not signify. It is part of a much larger pattern, just briefly, of antiquarian collecting of so-called Indian relics. This is extremely disruptive all across the Northeast as Euro-American aficionados of local history are digging things up. They are stealing, they are plundering sometimes human remains and putting them into historical societies as physical touchstones for what they frequently see as a bygone Native past, meaning Native history was very important, but it's over. And that is one of the things that I'm pushing against so strongly in this book, the notion that it's over. It is not over. There are Native survivors in all of these places, right? And yet their voices are not coming through collections like this. I did want to share at least one image from the Antiquarian Society collections here. This is one of the strangest I have ever come across, and it gives us a glimpse into how deeply invested Euro-Americans in the 19th century were in claiming the very places where this conflict happened for their own purposes, and for making them part of a Yankee narrative or a white local narrative. Has anyone been out to so-called Redemption Rock right here? Okay. Also in Nipmuc Homelands. In the 19th century, local antiquarians process out there en masse, literally stand up here, right, put their bodies onto this formation, chisel into it a message about Mary Rowlandson in captivity, and do everything in their power to claim this as part of their own history and to make their version of events the most visible in this. There is not in this picture a Native person, and yet there are Native people in the area whose understandings of this same place are quite different, but they are not being chiseled into rock. And this is, the precursor to what I'm sure all of us have seen many of around this region, road signs. They're everywhere. They are full of purported facts that upon closer examination often prove much more slippery. And this, I could have chosen, any one of 1,000 of these, but this one I think is especially illustrative. From Great Swamp, right, this really fraught location in Narragansett Homelands. This sign is put up that says, in the 1930s by the state of Rhode Island, 3/4 of a mile to the southward, on an island in the Great Swamp, the Narragansett Indians were decisively defeated by the united forces of the Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Plymouth colonies. If you had no other source of information, you might read the sign and conclude that the Narragansetts have vanished from this landscape, that they are no longer in existence as a people or as a sovereign nation. And this is something that these markers are very invested in, proclaiming the end of indigenous political authority, particularly. This is being erected about half a century after the state of Rhode Island illegally detribalized the Narragansetts, took their land, auctioned it off, and dissolved them, or attempted to, as a tribal nation. And so there's a lot of political work that's being done by this sign to say not only are the Narragansetts detribalized, but they are literally gone from this landscape. And yet, this is maybe my most favorite source in terms of this particular landscape. This is a page from a magnificent tribal publication produced in the 1930s called The Narragansett Dawn. Princess Redwing brings this into fruition as a magazine, and it publishes a lot of news from Native communities, particularly in southern New England. The section that I want to draw our attention to is a relation about Theodore Dennis Brown, who's a Narragansett community member. He had been a very young man when the tribe was detribalized by the state of Rhode Island, and he's extremely knowledgeable about these places. The story that he knows about Great Swamp is very different than the one relayed on that sign. It is not a notion of the end of his people. It's about continuance in this place. And where I've put the arrow at the bottom, he says, Theodore Dennis Brown, he will be very helpful to anyone seeking the historic landmarks of Rhode Island. He knows the location of every interesting spot in South County and the full story, tradition, or history of the place. He can direct or guide you into Big Swamp and a whole array of other places. This is a kind of counter-geography or counter-memory that we're getting a glimpse of through the Narragansett Dawn, and if you were able to tour alongside Theodore Dennis Brown, you would hear the much fuller version of how this is still a Narragansett place. The other thing that I would emphasize here is that in his sort of constellation of places here, they are not all about violence. They are not, in fact, primarily about violence. It's about a much more expansive history of community continuance west of the Bay. And I think that that is a very important corrective to how so many academic historians prefer to write about battles and wars and violence. Instead, this is asking us to think about everyday community survival and what that looks like. And this is some of the precursor to, much like on the Charles River, some extremely powerful gatherings and ceremonies that have taken place at Great Swamp right through the 20th into the 21st century. This one example from the 1960s. So, what we're seeing here is that memory is being viewed, understood, and acted in very different ways depending on the sources you look at, the places you are, the voices you listen to, the questions you ask. And there really is such local variation. I think this is a great case in point of that in the town of Natick, which is where Native families were rounded up before being shipped off to Deer Island, this is a mural that is on the wall of the post office. That, unlike almost all of the Great Depression-era murals in post offices, is not a heroic, triumphant image. It's not an upbeat one. It's showing one of the most shameful moments from Natick's history. And it's asking people to reckon with that as part of their own town's past. This is a really sort of fascinating and complicated site here that is created by a non-Native person who, in a certain way, is wanting to recall this history, but also not in its fullness. And perhaps one more thing on the theme of monuments before I then tie things together and give us a sense of the bigger contours of this. Monuments themselves are always in motion. They may be chiseled in stone, but the stories go on and people interact with them in often profound ways. And one of the examples of this is from Pesquiamscut, the landscape around that waterfall. In the year 1900, a local antiquarian organization installed a monument to recognize Captain William Turner, the English perpetrator of this who led his troops to the waterfall and inflicted such egregious damage on Native people there. And it is laconic. It says simply that he surprised and destroyed over 300 Indians. We do not have their names. We do not have their tribal affiliations. There's a real asymmetry to this, right? He is named. They are left as an anonymous mass. And this is part of the colonial landscape there. So you might imagine how excited I was to find in the archives and out on the land the fact that this monument continues to be remarked in ways that raise it into relief and ask new questions about it. On the left side, I found this in an archive, a photo from 1999. The slogan, "Free Leonard Peltier," right, about the American Indian activist, has been spray painted on top of it. That's not an accident that this site was chosen. It's asking people to rethink the history of Native people in relation to the United States, to genocide. On the right side, that I photographed when I was doing dissertation research in 2011, it was again vandalized, although I don't call this vandalism in my book. I say this is very particular remarking. Someone has chosen to put a message on this stone. I'm not totally sure what the message is, this kind of question mark, but it's asking people to look at this monument, to not just drive by it, as so many of us do when we see a stone with words on it, but to actually engage with this and think about what the story really might be. And without drawing this out too much, I would say this is a very timely moment in America more generally for rethinking what these touchstones are. And these two images of pushback against monuments to the Confederacy, right? Whose stories are being told here? Is this graffiti, or is this actually a retelling of history in a different way? The language we use matters intensely. And I would love for people to more comprehensively take a look at the monuments across New England to think about the ways that race and sovereignty and violence are encoded in them, and what the opportunities might be for telling other stories. I will say also that there has been a reconciliation in which the Narragansetts participated at Pesquiamscut with town officials in recent years, and this has opened up different possibilities for communication while also not kind of being the end of the story. The place that I want to bring us home to, though, and then I know we want to have some questions from folks, is the wider landscape of this war. That yes, so much of it happens right here in the Northeast, including this very area we're on, but it also has these reverberations out into what has been called an indigenous Atlantic world, a red Atlantic world, a native Atlantic, in ways that are really surprising to some, but have also been known and talked about within communities for years. And I'm going to skip just a couple of these for a moment. I'd be happy to talk about them if you want. What I'm doing is looking at the places that are not on the map, not on Jill Lepore's map, to say how does the story look different when we zoom out like this? Because what this story is about is the fact that for a really long span of time, really starting in 1492, colonizers had been thinking about how to harness the labor and the liberty of indigenous peoples throughout the hemisphere, and to violently often harness that labor for their own purposes. This begins with Columbus bringing Taino people back to Europe against their will. By the time we get to the 17th century, native people in New England are under threat to be taken as prisoners, to be enslaved by the English, to be turned into indentured servants, as the euphemism goes, against their will, and held in bondage. And this is happening inside colonial homes right here in New England, and it is happening much further from here. So the place I want to leave us here tonight is actually well out in the Atlantic world, in North Africa, Tangier, Morocco today, where the English, for a very short amount of time, had a colonial outpost. And this matters because it was to different English trading areas around the Atlantic that they were trying to figure out where they could sell native captives they had taken in New England. And one of these destinations is in North Africa. We are getting security updates. Well, we're really getting security updates. If anyone wants to try to fix this, I'll tell you what is happening here. There is some amazing documentation in England in the Public Record Office that is a list. There's a list in one library, and there's a document in the Public Record Office from the ship's captain. He's the captain, Thomas Hamilton, of a galley ship that is anchored by Tangier, and he's talking about the 30 New England Indians who have been sent to him and forced to labor in the most horrifying of conditions. Thank you. And this is one part of that story. When I came across this document in England, I actually cried when I found this, because people have said this document doesn't exist. We don't know what happened to people who were sent. And this was extremely moving on that count, and also because it's very hard to read. And I want to emphasize that this work of recovering indigenous histories requires paleography. It requires working with old manuscripts, and that is often very tedious labor. But the stories are there, even in archives, as well as family traditions. The story also extends in a really potent way to Bermuda, where I want to acknowledge the leading role that tribal community members and St. David's Islanders down in Bermuda have taken in what they have termed a reconnection in the last decade or so, regathering relations who are believed to have been sent to Bermuda, most likely to other places in the Caribbean, in addition or alongside, and coming together to recall this history not just of slavery, but also of survival and now of freedom across very complex multiracial contexts. And this story, right, so cogently shows how the story goes on in ways that are bringing people back together. And this one example from the objects they have created around this, a memorial quilt. But just to give you a sense of why these stories are still really hard to tell, I think this document from the Bermuda Archives that I came across a number of years ago is so telling about how English people, by and large, in the late 17th century, understood property, understood people unlike themselves. It is a probate record showing what is in the kitchen of an estate down in Bermuda, and you can see in it that there are both indigenous and African-descended people being listed as human property. They are named, but we have nowhere in this document a listing of what tribe they came from, of what particular community they may have come from. And this is one of the intractable obstacles in the archive, that the English people who were writing this down didn't really care about that. The archive was not designed to maintain those histories, and yet for the people themselves, that kind of familial connection and community connection must have mattered intensely. So there is always something just beyond what the archive may be able to tell us, but it is still such an important key. And that is where I want us to end here, with a shout-out to a recognition of John Christian Hopkins, a Narragansett author, community member, who picked up, I would say, where the archive stops in trying to envision what happened to Native people who survived King Philip's War in New England, but were sent out of their own homelands. And this novel, called Carlo Magno, Adventures of the Pirate Prince of the Wampanoags. It is fiction, but it is derived from actual historical events. It then takes off in its own direction and tells the story purportedly of what happened to some of the relations of King Philip, who were most likely sold into slavery. What happens to them? What becomes of them? And I think that this is an excellent note to end on. It tells me how creative Native scholars, Native community members have been in trying to work around these silences and in trying to bring into other forms and other visibilities stories of endurance and stories that tell how these places and peoples go on. That the story, unlike what the signs claim, is not over. It is very much happening now, and what is at stake in a place as far as the Caribbean may have everything to do with what an indigenous future looks like. Thank you.